Over the past few years, we've seen the rise of a new dramatic archetype on film, what we might call the sexually repressed BPD queen. These are women who are crazy. They're crazy because they're too sexy. They're too sexy because they're too repressed. These writhing, raving women seem to allude to some dark feminine shamanism, mystical, unknowable energies which are terrifying, yes, but also powerful avenues for liberation.
For me, Night Bitch sort of represents the mother's rage, and it's the suppressing of the rage that brings out this animalistic instinct.
A lot of this movie is about repressed intuition and rediscovering that voice inside of you, and pushing exterior voices farther away to make room for that voice.
Somebody said to me in an interview the other day, well, isn't Ellen like this victim? Like, why, you know what I mean? Like, what is it like to play this kind of like victimized character? And I was like, well, I don't think she's a victim at all. She calls out to him. She has a great deal of agency in this story that I feel like we haven't seen in iterations of the past.
Often the BPD queen is torn between two men, the nice guy and the bad boy. Think Poor Things, Babygirl, Nosferatu, Pearl. Generally speaking, the nice guy represents stability, maturity, companionship, and a sense of emotional connectedness, while the bad boy represents freedom, adventure, personal fulfillment, and sexual gratification. Each has something the other is lacking. Each represents a conflicting set of priorities for the woman torn between the two. They function as a sort of living embodiment of the Madonna whore complex. On the one hand, this has been the stuff of drama forever, prime ingredients for a classic love triangle. You can find these archetypes in stories like Dracula, The Phantom of the Opera, The Red Shoes, Outlander. Sometimes the woman chooses the nice guy, sometimes the bad boy. Sometimes the bad boy is actually a nice guy at heart, and the nice guy is actually a real piece of trash.
You unimaginable bastard.
Sometimes the woman discovers that the nice guy is actually her own brother. At the end of many of these stories, the conflict, at least thematically, still persists. In Phantom of the Opera, Christine might go off with Raoul at the end, but there's always some question of whether the Phantom doesn't still take precedence in her heart. In The Red Shoes, Victoria is so torn between love and art, between the nice guy and the bad boy, that she throws herself in front of a train. Where many of these modern films differ from similar love triangles of the past isn't just that sex is brought more to the forefront, but that it's also depicted as a sort of detached utilitarian commodity. The woman's libido becomes the prime manifestation of her autonomy. Sexual gratification is positioned as an act of rebellion against a culture of shame, against a cruel and repressive patriarchy. As Michelle Goldberg of the New York Times writes in her review of the film Babygirl, on the cusp of our terrible new era, it felt, for all its darkness and perversity, like an artifact of a more optimistic moment, when equality seemed close enough at hand that the orgasm gap between men and women could be a subject of serious concern. More than that, some entries in the BPD Queen canon seem to venture the idea that maybe you don't need to choose between the bad boy and the nice guy at all. Maybe you can have your cake and eat it too. In Poor Things, Bella runs away with Duncan for a life of debauched revelry, only for her and her former and maybe even current lesbian side piece to be re-embraced by Max at the end.
I find myself merely jealous of the men's time with you, rather than any moral aspersion against you. It is your body, Bella Baxter, yours to give freely.
In Babygirl, Nicole Kidman has a 50 Shades flavored tryst with a much younger man, but which by the end of the film results in a happier, healthier marriage and sex life with her husband. It seems a tryst with the bad boy is now seen as a right and necessary avenue towards self-actualization. Gosh, it's so fortunate that all these men are so enlightened, so accommodating. Then again, maybe this is what some men want too. A more modern, enlightened version of the manic pixie dream girl, emotionally detached but DTF. Who needs monogamy or emotional intimacy when you've got video games and weed? But what happens when all that goes wrong? What happens when an ethos of anything goes free love becomes a haven for freaks and sociopaths? When critics praise movies like Babygirl, they often talk about how they're a reflex against a culture of shame. They'll talk about power dynamics and how sexy it can be to get choked or spit on or whatever. As long as everybody is choking and spitting on each other responsibly, responsibly, of course. They'll say all that, but then act mystified when they hear stories about Neil Gaiman and other similar male feminists. Guys who, if I had to guess, bought into and or leveraged such feminist affirmations to their own lecherous advantage. You can imagine how some of the conversations might have went down between old Neil and some of the women now accusing him of sexual misconduct. Come on now, love, don't you want to be cool and feminist and sexually liberated like me, dark but soft goth wizard Neil Gaiman? Just get in the bathtub, come on. Before you know it, you're the off his and getting with a. To be clear, neither a work of art nor the characters in it need to be the paragons of moral virtue for the art to be good or the characters to be sympathetic or relatable. Avanti, from director Billy Wilder, is an excellent film which is essentially about how romantic it can be to sleep around on your wife. I think the sticking point here is when a story which might have once been acknowledged as being morally or emotionally complex is embraced as bluntly affirmational. Granted, you can do that, you can interpret a piece of art however you want, but then other people can call you a weird freak for doing so. What's interesting is how often certain themes have popped up recently, and in such quick succession. Both Nosferatu and Babygirl, both films involving cucking your husband, were released on Christmas Day, coinciding with maybe the most famous cucking in history, when Joseph got cucked by God and Mary gave birth to the baby Jesus. Immaculate and the first Omen were both released weeks apart, and both have nearly identical plots about a young nun who gets forcibly impregnated and gives birth to the Antichrist. Beyond all that, the BPD queen archetype isn't just about sex, it's sex tuned to a certain aesthetic frequency. The BPD queen archetype is prone to express her social and sexual frustration in a sort of exalted madness. She's prone to epileptic fits, screaming and contorting her face and body, expressing both the agony of repression and the ecstasy of release. At some point, everybody watched the same TikTok of Isabelle Adjani in possession and decided, there it is, there's the modern woman. Both Nosferatu and the first Omen, both released in the same year, cite the film as a direct influence.
When Lily first read the script, she immediately brought up Possession.
That's a movie that I love, and of course, you know, is one of the most iconic possession performances of all time, for good reason, because she's so incredible.
One of my favorite scenes of all time is from Possession. You know, that to me was a scene that spoke to like the female heart and the turmoil that I think every woman feels.
I imagine these images are meant to invoke the dark feminine jubilation of the witch's Sabbath, the wild, inscrutable desires of female hysteria patients. On their own, these are powerful symbols, but over time have been whittled down into cringe feminist platitudes. We're the granddaughters of the witches you couldn't burn.
I practice witchcraft, but it's sort of a political distinction, and I think it like speaks to my radical feminism after the election, especially. You know, I think what the witch is good for is being a force of divine feminine power, and witches are what men like Donald Trump are afraid of.
Trying to conjure the cool, authentic, pagan feminine aura of the witch's Brocken also brings with it the much less cool, much more performative aura of gender-confused Instagram Wiccans casting period blood magic on Donald Trump. Beyond hysteria, these images seem to dovetail with a generation increasingly enamored with its own neurosis, self-diagnosing, self-soothing, adopting Tourette's-like symptoms from watching TikTok, a generation whose perception of sex and relationships is increasingly influenced by porn. This screaming and writhing around draws upon a zeitgeist which is already performative and fake, but then tries to repurpose it as something primal and authentic. This BPD queen aesthetic might also manifest as the woman smiling but she's crazy motif that's popped up a lot recently. It's like you can see the pipeline from the Salon article to the movie screen. Don't you tell these women they should smile more.
Pretty girls should always smile.
The cultural membrane between art and social media has gotten so thin that you can pretty much pin down the themes of a film just from the trailer alone or from reading an article in Variety. It seems the ambition of many films nowadays is not just to entertain, to inspire, or to make you think. It's also to, quote, be a part of the conversation information. Many films seem to be working backwards from how media literate they are, how much navel-gazing they might inspire from New York Times columnists or YouTube video essayists. The art of subtext or artistic interpretation has been abandoned in favor of telling everyone exactly what the themes are ahead of time and how they relate to the conversation. And because this is Hollywood, all the conversation amounts to really is the same progressive cultural affirmations repeated ad nauseum. What are these films really saying that's new or challenging or revelatory when it's just repeating the same things that are already affirmed and applauded in the zeitgeist? Anyway, I think that's all I have to say about that. Just some things I've been noticing lately in a lot of modern films. Let me know what you think. Subscribe if so inclined. I write books if you like books. Okay, goodbye.